about the next generation learning standards. How exciting. All of the links that I have embedded into this slideshow are also available on the New York State Ed site. NewYorkState.ed.gov, Next Generation Learning Standards. Anything I share with you this evening, even the copies that I gave you in hard copy in your folder, are all located on the state website. So where are we going to go this evening? My focus question is, what does a new set of standards in the context of today's literacy demands mean for instruction? So basically, if we break it down, what we're talking about is how can we ensure that all students have the opportunity to develop advanced literacies. We'll break down the term advanced literacies tonight, and we'll dive deep into the introduction of the next generation learning standards so that you have a really good idea of what this term advanced literacies mean. So our agenda. I'm going to give you some background knowledge on how we got to the next generation learning standards. What was our journey to this point? I will also share the next generation learning standards timeline. The best part about the presentation is I'm going to share with you a presentation from Supporting All Students conference that happened when the next gen standards were rolled out. This conference is from November, and it's Dr. Nonie Lesaux. Does anybody know Dr. Lesaux? Or has anybody had the opportunity to hear her speak? She is wonderful, and she was the keynote to kick off the information that was shared with all of this next generation learning standards. So I think the message that she has to share really does speak volumes for the direction we're going with these new standards for New York State. After she read over the state standards for next gen, she had her input. She created what is called advanced literacies briefs. There are 8 briefs to help school districts really understand the next generation learning standards and be able to implement them. Then we'll talk about next steps with the next generation learning standards, including a roadmap that the state put out with the outlined timeline, goals for each one of the phases to implement the standards. So here's some background knowledge. Say farewell to the Common Core Learning Standards, and hello to the Next Generation Learning Standards. If you know me, you know I'm a very positive person. I try to think of, look at the bright side of everything. But I do not feel like I'm being naive here when I say this is more than just rebranding. This is more than just taking off the Common Core Learning Standards because, right, they were bad, everybody hated them, and put on a terminology of the Next Generation Learning Standards. It has a different feel. And I'll go through that right now. So how did we get here? We know we had the race to the top, was in 2009. It was the national movement to improve education. We adopted the Common Core Learning Standards in 2011. We can say now they were improperly implemented. The testing rollout was rushed. There was a lot of pushback. We had some disruption, anxiety from both school districts, educators, and parents. So Governor Cuomo said, we need to develop a task force to look at the Common Core Learning Standards. We need to do a comprehensive review. So when that task force looked at the standards, they looked at what was working and what was not working. There are really good pieces in the Common Core Learning Standards. They engaged parents, teachers, students, and other stakeholders in this input as they went through for this task force. They reviewed the standards, related it to curriculum, and reviewed the testing process. They made recommendations for improving these components to ensure the highest quality education, The task force made 21 different recommendations moving forward from the Common Core Learning Standards to the Next Generation Learning Standards. If you would like to read the final task force report, it is on the New York State website. Here are the recommendations from the task force. 5 of them had to do with establishing new high-quality New York standards, developing better curriculum guidance and resources for educators, significantly reducing testing time and preparation, ensure that the test fits the curriculum and the standards, ensure that there is a successful transition to a new system of implementing the next generation standards and assessing the next generation learning standards. And a few quotes from the task force report that I extracted out because I love them. We have a chance now. New York State has a chance to get it right, and we must get it right for our children. There is too much at stake. It is time to right the ship. So the creation of the Next Generation Learning Standards was a collaborative effort. In 2015, they began the process of reviewing the Common Core Learning Standards. There were 130 educators and parents involved in the task force of looking at and reviewing the standards. It was a 2-year process between starting to review and actually adopting them from the Board of Ed. The review committee included 94 teachers, 21 administrators, 3 library media specialists, 4 college professors, and 16 parents. So they had a lot of different stakeholder involvement in going over and reviewing the Common Core Learning Standards. When we think about also soliciting feedback from educators, they reviewed more than 4,100 public comments. Raise your hand if you filled out a survey about the Common Core Learning Standards. They wanted to know our input. They wanted to have feedback from us. They considered extensive feedback from experts in the field of early childhood, English language learners, students with disabilities. They established an early learning standards task force to look over the pre-K to grade 2 standards, looking for developmental appropriateness. They included recommendations by the governor's task force as they were going through and revamping to make the Next Generation Learning Standards. They assured that the changes would not be rushed like they were last time. So what we have here are the revised standards that really do reflect a collaborative effort and expertise from, as I said before, many different stakeholders. So let's look at the timeline that we have for the Next Generation Learning Standards. They were adopted in September of 2017. For this coming school year, the 18-19 school year, it is considered phase 1. Phase 1 is to raise awareness. They call it awareness building. There will be professional development held within your school districts, held at the BOCES level for professional development on the Next Generation Learning Standards. I will share with you a lot of documents this evening that you can take and support back in your schools, in your classroom, in your districts to help whether it's PLCs or your classroom teachers, things like that, to help raise awareness. At West Genesee, we have a Literacy Institute that kind of helps me lead our charge for literacy in our district, and we will be working a lot with raising awareness and turnkeying the awareness and the PD out to all educators at West Genesee. So then we get into the 1920 school year. This is phase 2. This is when you build capacity. When you start implementing what you've learned about the Next Generation Learning Standards, what you've learned about the approach to literacy instruction, and you start looking at what you have in place, whether it's a core program, whether it's instructional practices. What is it that you have in place? And looking at really truly honing and saying, do our practices align with the Next Generation Learning Standards? Then we get into September 2020 and beyond. It's phase 3. This is full implementation. Full implementation of the Next Generation Learning Standards. So essentially, starting this school year, we have 3 years to understand these standards before we begin to assess them and before we begin to implement them. Spring 2021 will be the first time the new 3 through 8 Next Generation Learning Standards will be measured through an assessment. So I like to tell our teachers at West Genesee, it's our current kindergarten class. We'll be the first group of 3rd graders that will be assessed on the Next Generation Learning Standards. In your handout, you have what is called the at-a-glance flyer. What I'd like to do is just give you a moment to look over the at-a-glance flyer. That kind of reviews, it's a quick down and dirty snapshot of the implementation timeline and where we were and where we're going with the Next Generation Learning Standards. So that flyer is wonderful to pass out to educators, to give them just an overview of each one of the phases. We do have 3 years, we have time. If you're going to hear anything with the theme tonight, they have given us the gift of time to do it right. So what I'd like to do next is just go through some of the highlights of the changes from the Next Generation Learning Standards, from the Common Core, I should say, Learning Standards to the Next Generation Learning Standards. So what are some of the highlights? They added a lifelong reading and writing practices section. They merged the reading for information and reading for literature standards. They revised the reading expectations for text complexity. And the range of student reading experiences and text complexity experiences are outlined, not only in the introduction, but throughout the Next Generation Learning Standards. There's a new section before the standards for the range of student reading experiences. If you remember, the old standard 10 was students could read with proficiency and accuracy at grade level text for both literature and information. That is no longer a standard. It is now embedded in the preface of before each one of the standards for each grade level in the area of reading. Some more highlights that we have. They still do have the 4 major strands. It's organized the same way. We have the reading strand with the reading foundational standards embedded. We have the writing strand, speaking and listening strand, and the language strand. They did revise the standards for clarity, consistency, and conciseness, hence why they put together the reading for information and the reading literature standards, because there were some redundancies there as far as breaking down RLs and RIs. We went from 34 anchor standards to 28 anchor standards in pre-K to 8th grade. And the standards are grade level banded for 9th and 10th, and then for 11th and 12th. There's a glossary of terms in the appendices. And they created a New York State introduction to inform curriculum and instruction development. And that's what we'll be taking a deep dive into tonight so that you can really understand the introduction and where we're going with these Next Generation Learning Standards. They do have available to you crosswalks. There is an overview crosswalk that just gives you a general overview of the changes that were made going from the Common Core Learning Standards to the Next Gen Standards. And then they break it down by grade, so you can see the one column would have the Common Core Learning Standards, the next column has the Next Generation Learning Standards, and they actually cross off and add where edits and changes have been made, so you can kind of look at that document and see where the changes were made. Again, located on the New York State website. So, like I said, I got very excited, that's an understatement, when I watched Dr. Nonie Lesaux' Keynote when they adopted and had the Next Generation Learning Standards Supporting All Students Conference. This was the rollout and basically the jumpstart to where we are going with the next gen standards, and it speaks volumes for how this is different, not just in name only. So much of what she outlines and talks about aligns to what we know the research says about reading instruction. So I feel like everything is kind of converging at this perfect moment where we have these new standards that are really reflecting the research base, and we have a time where we're really listening to the research base, and all of you are here tonight because you support the Reading League that way. I did break down, her keynote is about an hour and a half long, so I broke it down into 7 to 11 minute segments that really do highlight what we want to know as we pursue and as you start this journey into the next generation learning standards. The first one I'm going to show you is her introduction. She talks about herself a little bit, and she talks about how she was asked to come on board to look at the standards, to review the next generation learning standards, and to then inform educators by writing the brief series that she wrote. This is a 7-minute video.
Good morning. Nice to see you all, and I love Saratoga Springs. I'm Canadian, so I've spent the last 14 years kind of getting to know this country, the Northeast, across to the Southwest, etc., and it's been great. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a privilege. I have watched, and in partnership with New York State for many years, sort of watched the evolution of a lot of different initiatives, including this one around standards. And one thing I can tell you from having worked with different states over the last 15 years or so is that I was struck by just how collaborative this latest process was. And that's really commendable in a lot of respects. It's especially important as we think about educating the whole population, never mind which kids belong to whom, but how do we all do this together? I'll tell you a little about my background, and then I'll talk a little about how I was thinking about teeing up a fabulous day at the beginning of probably what is a multi-year initiative for all of you, and certainly recognizing, as the commissioner did, that the set of standards is only as good as what follows. And I'm going to sort of focus this morning on the implementation side and on sort of the broad landscape for, you can start quibbling with standards, but I don't think that's probably the right approach, given that really what we want to do is treat those as a guidepost and think about how do we design effective learning environments, and as a consequence, meet those standards. And they're never going to be perfect, right? We can all understand them to be a work in progress also. My background takes me to the mid-90s in Vancouver, British Columbia, when I was working in the school district, and we had about 35 native languages in the school district. Vancouver is a city that had been radically transformed in a very short time by immigration. We had in Vancouver, and still has, the poorest and the wealthiest neighborhood in Canada, within miles of each other. And you all know what that means when you then look at a school district and the schools, and how to understand the variation and how to think about pulling everybody along and pushing everyone forward. And at the time, our research about second language learners was primarily about whether to teach them in the native language or in English. So sort of at the time, kind of highly politicized, mostly from here in the US, kind of dating back to the 70s, like what language should we teach them in, which doesn't answer the question when you have 35 languages about your strategy. It also doesn't answer the question about quality of instruction, right? So we can do high quality instruction in any language. We can do low quality instruction in any language. So that scenario took me to my graduate work, which was really about how do we both prevent reading difficulties among all students, not just necessarily our majority culture, mainstream native English speakers, but how do we think about a model of instruction for the kind of school district that we had in front of us in Vancouver, which we also knew was going to be the kind of school district that would eventually find its way across the country and here in the US, and is certainly bearing out today as not just an urban profile, but we are educating a more and more diverse population in every town and community across the country. I did my doctorate in the evenings. I was, focused on these questions about reading difficulties and reading development for all learners, especially in the early years, and how we might better understand those profiles. The work on learning disabilities, you won't be surprised, at the time we were really focused on sort of the profile of a child who may have a reading disability, quote unquote, eventually takes you to thinking about how do we better design overall learning environments, what's now called universal design for learning. What does the data tell us about how we do better by many more children and prevent difficulties for those who may be at risk? I've been at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for almost 15 years. Most of my work is in partnership with school districts and states and communities who are focused on effective learning environments for all children. In the 0 to 5 space, of course, that looks and feels slightly different than in school districts, but the reality is we're talking about pathways of learning and informal and formal learning opportunities that add up over time. For today, the backdrop, by the way, I'm more than happy to make these slides available to all of you, and to the extent that they end up helpful to you in your work, you ought to use them if you run PLCs or you give presentations or you just want them for reference. You are more than welcome to them. They're just a resource as you kick off this important work. So our latest collaboration, it's been a pleasure to know Angelica and Lisette for a long time, to get to know Mary Cahill and her hardworking team. This latest collaboration was really around this question of what does a new set of standards in the context of today's literacy demands mean for instruction? What are we talking about if we think about the implementation? So certainly read the standards and maybe had too much feedback along the way, but that's okay. That's what I was asked to do. But really, I think the critical part is what do these standards mean, especially when we think about today's learners and today's literacy demands. And so the backdrop for the session is that, we generated Emily Phillips Galloway and I. She was a student of mine, is a former reading teacher, now on faculty at Vanderbilt. What we generated was what we're calling a briefs series, and there are 8 of them. You have 2 briefs, I think, in your packet, the anchor briefs. There are then 4 others that call out the hallmarks, and we have 2 kind of spotlight briefs. These are all available online, and again, this deck you are more than welcome to. So that's the backdrop, is that what Emily and I did after reviewing the standards is said to ourselves, well, if we back this up and set these standards in the context of today's literacy challenges and demands, and what all of this means for instructional design, here's a set of briefs that may be a helpful guidepost in the work going forward.
You also have in your folder the 2 anchor briefs, Advanced Literacies, Brief 1, and What Goes into Effective Reading Comprehension, Brief 2. So as you think about where we were with the Common Core learning standards and the process that we're undertaking as we go into the next generation learning standards, I'm going to give you an opportunity now to take a deep dive into the introduction that you have in your folders. Your task is going to be read the introduction to the New York State Next Generation ELA standards, discuss with a partner or small group these three questions. 1, how are the standards defined in the introduction? 2, to whom do the standards apply? 3, why were the standards revised? At this time, I'm going to give you an opportunity to work, to read through them, and to discuss these three questions, and then we will review. If at any time during the 15 minutes you need to get up and go to the bathroom, or you need to you go and do any of the raffles, they're out there for you to do. We don't have a scheduled break, but during this work session, if you need to take a break, please do so. So your three questions: how are the standards defined? To whom do they apply? Why were the standards revised? So your first question, what are the standards? The standards are knowledge, skills, understanding that individuals can do and habitually demonstrate over time. On page 1, it is outlined. This introduction is just jam-packed with really good information about the approach that the Next Generation Learning Standards will be taking. I have mine highlighted and marked up all over the place as I was going through and reading it. It's a perfect document to share with colleagues, to share at faculty meetings, to develop PLCs around and discuss what is it as we're moving forward with these advanced literacies. What is the Next Generation Learning Standards telling us? They are educational expectations. They are what students should know and be able to do independently by the end of their grade level. Question 2, actually still question 1, focusing. Standards are not instructional strategies, choices in literature, programmatic designs, curriculum. That was highlighted on page 14. To whom do these standards apply? Everyone, all means all. Does all mean all in your district? All students across all tiers. Your English language learners, your students with disabilities. How can you help support all learners with the Next Generation Learning Standards? How can we design and implement instruction for all students in the area of literacy so that we're meeting the needs of all children, bringing them up, pushing them forward, helping them to be successful. Hopefully with my background knowledge slides, you knew the answer to this one before you even read the introduction. There are new demands on being literate. We're going to hear Dr. Lesaux talk about literacy today and the demands in the workforce for the generation of students that we are raising right now as far as teaching them how to be literate and how to read. This notion of advanced literacies, it was outlined several different times in your introduction and in the margin. We'll talk a little bit about what does advanced literacies mean. And then, of course, the 2015 legislative requirements saying we need to look over the Common Core Learning Standards. They need to be reassessed with stakeholder input. Loads of info that the state has given us to help us on our 3-year journey of implementing the Next Generation Learning Standards. This is just tonight, scratching the surface of all the documentation that's available to you all as far as professional development to understand the Next Generation Learning Standards. So much information just in the introduction, like I said, to share with colleagues, to share at building and district level. In addition to the introduction, there is an Early Learning Standards introduction written by the Early Learning Task Force. There are fact sheets, there's a preface, there are crosswalks. There is a blueprint for improved results with students with disabilities. There is a blueprint that was written for ELL success. There are the anchor standards, grade level standards for each grade level. There is a 6 through 12 literacy standards for the content area, for infusing literacy into science, social studies, and technology. and what we'll dive into right now, the brief series to help educators understand the next generation learning standards. So there is a lot of information out there. Again, the beauty is that we have time to decipher it. We have time to go through it. We have time to do it right. So when you think you have an entire school year of just awareness building, and then when we talk about capacity building, you're still also understanding all of these documents and all of the process for the next generation learning standards. So what are the advanced literacy briefs? In your folder, you have the 2 anchor briefs. Brief 1, advanced literacies for academic success. Brief 2, what goes into effective reading comprehension. In addition to these briefs, there are 4 hallmarks. The hallmarks are the practices to be able to achieve the outlines of those 2 briefs. Then they have what's called 2 spotlight briefs to really give you a good solid indication of how some of this work in the next generation learning standards can be implemented. What will that really look like? Units of study. They don't actually give you units of study, but they give you an outline of what is units of study. And then language production projects. The next piece is Dr. Lesaux talking about rethinking what it means to be literate in our society. What counts as literate is on the rise. In your introduction, they have a separate section, a heading that says Changing Expectations for Literacy Achievement. It's in the bottom of the first page into the second page. It outlines a little of what she will talk about in this video. In the margin of your introduction on the first page, there is Advanced Literacies, a call to prepare students for lifelong learning. So this is about a 5-minute video outlining what it means for our students to be literate and where they're going in today's society. She will reference a chart, and it's the changing demands of workforce participation. It's in your handout. This is the chart that she will be referencing as she's talking a little bit about the workforce and what our students need to know.
The short story is that we have a different literacy context today than in many decades past. That we are rethinking what it means to be literate. That what counts as literate is actually on the rise. So as we look at data and get concerned about where students are, and we look at students and ourselves all on our phones and texting, I think the key reminder here is that it's not the kids these days. It's not that literacy skills among the population are actually on the decline. It's that what counts as literate is on the incline. It's on the rise. That we need increasingly sophisticated literacy skills to thrive day to day. In today's economy and society, we use information and print and communication skills in a very different way than we did even 15 years ago, even 15, 20 years ago. We have a new role of language and literacy skills in society. And as we think about that, we think about at the same time that we do have an increasingly diverse population we are educating. Culturally and linguistically diverse, but also we today have children experiencing poverty at higher rates than in the last several decades, and that's the 2009 economic crisis that we have not yet fully recovered from. With this changing population and the demographics, we worry about sufficient development of language and literacy skills, of social, emotional, and cognitive skills. We worry a lot about the way in which some of our demographics are tracking with special ed placement and dropout, right? So we know that. We also know that there is a serious press, not just to think about those populations who are underserved, but to think hard about how we're going to push everyone forward in a country where our 8th graders don't even bat 500 on proficiency on the NAEP test, for example. 34% of 8th graders at or above proficient on the NAEP test across the country. And what is it when I say that literacy demands are on the incline, on the rise, increasing? What am I talking about? Well, if I channel my colleagues who are labor economists, what I'm talking about is a different kind of workforce and labor market today than even 15 years ago. So what has happened in the last several decades, this is not very big, let me walk you through this graph. The top 2 lines show growth from 1960 to 2009 in jobs that are characterized by 2 things. First, the ability to work with new information. Second, solving unstructured problems. Those are the fastest growing jobs. Those jobs that you see in the bottom 3 lines that are on the decline involve first, routine manual tasks, second, non-routine but still manual tasks, and third, routine cognitive tasks. So working with new information and solving unstructured problems are the 2 tasks that make up the fastest growing jobs in this country. How do we explain that? How would you explain the difference between those top 2 lines in this graph and the drop in the bottom 3, which are routine manual tasks, non-routine manual tasks, and routine cognitive tasks? What explains that shift, which is extremely dramatic in a short period of time? Anybody want to wager a guess? Technology. Computers. Most certainly, right? So what you have is manual labor having been automatized. And when you see non-routine manual tasks and routine cognitive tasks, remember, there's even some degree of artificial intelligence out there, right? So there is machine learning happening, and that is how we now replace lots and lots of manual labor through that technology. So working with new information, solving unstructured problems is where, of course, human capital comes in. Not easily done because there's no algorithm for either of those things, right? Even those who once worked in the plant, and the plant is increasingly automatized, the jobs of those humans who are now in those plants are much more sophisticated, higher level, because what they're doing is solving unstructured problems. What just happened here, or how do we accommodate for a new demand on the work? So we want to be clear that, in part, our lens today brings together a changing demographic in the population in general because of globalization across this world, and second, a new economy that is really built around now thinking about how do humans continue to add value in a knowledge-based economy and even drive that knowledge-based economy. So we think a lot about the way in which how we're preparing young children to do jobs computers can't do. We're going to refocus and think about the fact that what we're doing is really ratcheting up what we consider to be foundational skills. So where once the 8th or 10th grade education with basic literacy skills was still perfectly satisfactory to find one's way into a middle-class lifestyle. That is no longer the case. So the economy and the society has sort of raised the baseline on what it means to be to have foundational skills, which now are really pushing on communication and problem solving at the end of the day, right? So we're thinking about how we do that. And at the same time, the business leaders are reporting this quote-unquote steady decline in workplace literacy skills. In many respects, their complaints actually reflect the incline, right? So they're suggesting it's getting worse. In fact, in part, it's a bit of both. It's actually that the context is, the demands are increasing. But either way, we have a workforce that needs more support for their technical literacy skills, for their problem-solving skills, and their ability to work collaboratively. Because the other slides that I didn't bring for today show that if we unpack this graph one more time, what you get in those jobs where folks are working with new information and solving unstructured problems is they're having to work collaboratively in teams. That the new work world is really about team-based work, and in these fastest growing jobs especially. So we're going to think that through on the communications problem solving front. We're going to think about the context of higher education, which is sort of trying desperately to sort of reorganize around how do we get students to a place where they have the literacy skills in a hurry. And they're also increasingly emphasizing these multidisciplinary kind of programs, interdisciplinary lenses, the group work, the innovation challenges, the hackathons, the kinds of things that they're seeing in the workforce, trying to bring those in to the higher education space. So if we map workforce demands to curriculum design, for example, where we land is sort of something like this. Team-based, project-based approaches as pretty typical and common. We land on an emphasis on building up conceptual reasoning skills and background knowledge across subject areas. Remember, if we're solving unstructured problems and working with new information, we've got to start with the ability to reason conceptually and with facility, with proficiency. And we're also going to better set up our students if they've got lots of background knowledge. We've got an emphasis on written and oral communications meant to convey knowledge and reasoning to others, which is, here's our pitch for how we think we ought to solve this problem. Here's our pitch for how we think we ought to do our work over the next several months. Here's what it means for the budget, etc. And we've got this emphasis on solving unstructured problems, those that have several potential solutions, the no right or wrong answers, weighing trade-offs against priorities to arrive at that best solution. So the summary of today's context is that we have an increasingly linguistically, culturally, and economically diverse population. We remind ourselves that what counts as literate is on the rise, that unlike past decades, reading and writing have become prerequisites for participation in nearly every aspect of day-to-day 21st century life. The design of literacy instruction has probably, in that sense, not kept pace with this shift from the need for basic to what is now advanced literacies, and so we think about the more systems-level strategic approach.
Okay, so part of the slideshow that's embedded in this slideshow comes from Dr. Lesaux's keynote. It is also available on the state ed site. What she's saying, what counts as literate is on the rise. Increasingly more sophisticated literacy skills needed to thrive day to day. Rethinking literacy as well. We know we have an increase in cultural and linguistic diversity. We know we have an increase in rates of poverty. We know we have compromised opportunities to develop the language and reading skills. There is a press. I like how she says it. There's a press. There's a press for us to make sure that we have students being able to be proficient readers and writers and communicators so that they can be successful. Kind of scary when she talks about human capital. Like, how are we as humans going to support the economy and move it forward? It all comes down to having these advanced literacies. So brief 1 really does highlight and outline what does it mean by advanced literacies. Brief 2 talks about what goes into effective reading comprehension. We are going to hear Dr. Lesaux talk about effective reading comprehension. Then your next task, your last task of the evening, is to go through and take a deep dive into both of these briefs, which you have in your handout folder today, and really talk to colleagues and outline what are the focus points of these briefs, how do these align to what I read in the introduction to the Next Generation Learning Standards, and how do these align to my practices or future practices that I will have as far as literacy instruction. The next one, what goes into effective reading comprehension. If you'd like to follow along, you have that outlined you have that brief in your folder. Effective reading comprehension.
In the brief series that we generated to kind of back out a little from the standards and say what might the implementation look like, we have 2 anchor briefs, one of which is really about reading comprehension, and I think it's in your packet. What I want to do for a moment is talk about a key aspect in all of this instructional design and even in your leadership and work with how you're talking about reading. I want to make a distinction that I think is worth holding on to as you move in to your design and implementation phases following these new standards. So let's just start quickly with this brief passage which is about sharks. And I'm not going to read it all, but it's pretty straightforward. There are almost 400 different kinds of sharks. Each kind of shark looks different, has a unique diet, behaves differently, on and on and on. When a 3rd grader goes to read that passage, that 3rd grader is tapping at least 2 broad sets of skills within this thing we call reading comprehension or even reading. There are skills that we talk about as code-based skills, right? The student who can sound out the word shark, those 3 sounds, automatically sound those out, put them back together, and read the word shark. The student who has the spelling patterns down at the level of the 26 letters and 44 sounds, and the 3rd grader who reads at about 100 words correct per minute in order to have the quote-unquote space left over to make meaning of the passage while reading. Those are the code-based skills. They're what we think of as the mechanics, right? The mechanics of reading. On the other side, we've got meaning-based skills. The student has to have the vocabulary, the cognitive strategies, the relevant background knowledge, has to understand the language and how it's constructed in that passage, and has to have, in some respects, the interest and motivation, which often is driven entirely by the competencies on the code and meaning-based side to even do this work. What I want to be clear about is that in any work on literacy and reading, instructional design, assessment, looking at data, that you do in your work, you want to be understanding at the level of the reader, how is that student doing on code-based skills and on meaning-based skills? 2 totally different sets of skills and competencies. So at a minimum, you want to talk about reading in 2 ways, not as one thing, not as one construct. We shouldn't really be talking about low readers right? Struggling reader. We should be specific. We should know enough about that reader to say it's a code problem, it's a meaning-based problem, or it's both, right? It has real implications for those of you who are using levels in your work, talking about students at different reading levels, because remember that I could be at one level and Angelica could be at the same level, but one of us could have a code-based problem, and one of us could be on the meaning-based side. And we need very, very different supports, right? So as you think through any instructional design work and implementation of the standards, you're going to think about that distinction between code-based reading skills and meaning-based reading skills and competencies. And you're going to take with you, in the context of this discussion about the increasing role that communication and problem-solving skills are playing in today's society and economy, you're going to take with you a profile that we are seeing more and more right across the income spectrum and right across the demographic spectrum in terms of diversity, which is that we have a whole lot of readers who are solid on the code-based side of reading, who have mastered the 26-letter, 44-sound symbol combinations, and yet who are not at sufficient, have not developed their meaning-based skills to a sufficient level to make meaning from text. What I want to be clear about is that many of us could, in fact, have this profile depending on the text that we pick up. So if I pick up the Financial Times newspaper, I can more than certainly read the words on the page, or if I walked across the Harvard campus into a biochemistry PhD seminar, I could read the words on the page and I could maybe make some meaning from that print, but I would not be working at quote-unquote grade level. So what we want to think about here are two things. One, we always need to make this distinction at the level of the reader and our readers when we look at their data, that we understand how are they doing in the code-based domain and how are they doing in the meaning-based domain. We don't pit one against the other. We absolutely need to develop their code-based skills and get them solid on the mechanics of reading. But on the meaning-based side, we have a lot more intensive, explicit work to do. And that's how I sort of set some of this advanced literacies, the content of this advanced literacies work. I set it in that context, which is to say, we need to be as systematic and intentional and explicit on the meaning-based side from the pre-K years through the secondary years so that they can keep up with the changing demands of the curriculum, with the way in which the curriculum becomes more and more content-rich and language-heavy over time. What that means in the earliest years is that it's not sufficient to use the same text to teach the mechanics to teach language and knowledge. What we need to do is be sure that we are very, very strong on the complexity of the knowledge and the concepts and the cognitive rigor in the learning environment, but not while making them read the words on the page, right? So we have two very different spaces. And until our field generally gets super solid on those distinctions and understands them as equally important, and that on the meaning-based side, this is going to take a big press from the earliest years right through secondary school, then I would argue we are not ever going to meet the standards and the expectations that we are setting for everybody. So we're going to think about that. Oh, yay, that's exciting. That was inspiring to you. It means, though, just at the smallest level of a nudge, let's not talk about this thing called reading. Like, let's not talk about a low reader. Let's get in the habit of saying we're doing well in this area of reading and we need more work in another area, right? The code and the meaning. It means in assessments, we can't stop at one reading level or one reading score and group kids accordingly, because they could have gotten to that very same score with two very different profiles. That is low-hanging fruit in a lot of your districts. If we just dug a little deeper and grouped by profile, we would serve many more students more efficiently.
Anyone else want to do a slow clap? Woo! So the outline, the roots of reading, look familiar? Code-based skills, meaning-based skills. Our simple view of reading. This is what I was saying. I would say this is what got me the most excited by some of the briefs. When you think about the code-based skills and the meaning-based skills, and that we have to start talking about readers within these two pieces to make up that pot of gold, which is reading comprehension, that's very powerful to be coming from a keynote talking about the next generation learning standards. And it gets me so excited when it is that aligned to what the research is saying about literacy instruction. So you have the two anchor briefs. I'm going to give you an opportunity now to take a deep dive into both of those briefs. You have a chart in your folder, and it outlines 3 columns. 1, the important points of the anchor briefs. 2, the connection to the next generation learning standards from these 2 briefs. And lastly, the column has the connections to instructional practices. I think what Dr. Lesaux was saying was very valuable. We need to start talking about students as code-based skills and meaning-based skills, or having code-based needs and meaning-based needs. And as I run data meetings at our district at West Genesee, I am very clear with educators to say, okay, you say it's a reading comp issue. Is it a code issue? Is it a meaning issue? And it does have implications when we start talking just one level, or just one score, or just one lexile, or just one percentage. So we'll have 15 minutes on the clock. Again, if you also need this time to use the facilities or to put your tickets in the raffles, please do so. Filling in the chart with for these 3 columns, and discuss your findings with a partner. 15 minutes. Hopefully this task gave you an opportunity to look at the briefs and synthesize a little bit about how it addresses the introduction as well. You were able to reflect on your connections to your own practice. Usually I share out after this, but I think this venue is quite large for sharing out. But at least you had an opportunity to think about the connections to the next gen standards, to think about the connections to your own practices as you read these briefs. Do I have anyone brave enough that would like to share out anything that they filled in their chart? Any of the briefs? Well, at least it was a time for you all to reflect, which is good, and I heard a lot of good conversation happening. So this notion of advanced literacies, I really just want to address one more time. We have a few more slides left this evening. I want you to hear Dr. Lesaux talk a little bit more about what it means when she talks about advanced literacies. What are the skills and competencies that comprise advanced literacies? You will notice it is a running theme throughout all of the briefs, throughout the introduction, and throughout the next generation learning standards. How are these skills and competencies the core of your instruction? How are we making sure that we are focusing on them? And why is this important for all students? After we go through this, I just want to give an overview of the hallmarks and the spotlight briefs, because we won't have an opportunity to go through in a deep dive tonight with our time restraints. So we'll go through that. Dr. Lesaux will talk a little bit about the other pieces that you can use as you're building in phase one, your awareness of the next generation learning standards and your understanding of literacy instruction. And then the last thing I want to share with you this evening is the roadmap, because the state did put out a roadmap on the phases, and each one of the phases has goals and objectives and things that you can go through with your district to know that you've accomplished the goals for each one of the phases, getting us to 2021, where we have full implementation of the next generation learning standards. So here's Dr. Lesaux talking one more time about advanced literacies.
So you'll see in that one of those briefs, we're sort of saying at the pre-K level, you know, our snapshot is a little girl working on her vocabulary, her meta-linguistic awareness, how she understands different synonyms for words, and some cross-linguistic facility as a Spanish speaker. By the third grade, we're talking about some academic vocabulary in the context of conceptual reasoning. As we move up the ages, this is just a snapshot. We're talking about reading multiple sources and written argumentation, but even that doesn't wait until the secondary years, right? We're building up to that sooner. And finally, our 12th grader is conducting research, preparing for a debate, and doing some technical writing. That brief just unpacks this idea of advanced literacies, taking into account what I've just run through in terms of today's economy and society, and where we want all students to get to. So the question becomes, how can we provide all learners with enhanced opportunities to build their oral and written language skills and deepen their knowledge of abstract concepts and ideas? What it leads to is a few outdated guiding principles that I think we want to push on in our instructional design and implementation. Answering that question means grappling with the new realities. So the first is that, you know, for a long time we thought about students learning academic English at school as sort of a small subpopulation. We sort of had ESL and academic English as sort of a small group over here. We teach them in ESL, we bring them into the mainstream, and they go forward. The reality is that we have a linguistically diverse school-age population. We also find more and more in our research when we unpack advanced literacies among today's population. In fact, the strengths and needs of English learners and their classmates are actually much more similar than they are different. The fastest growing group of those children who are linguistically and culturally diverse are those children born here in the US, coming up through our school systems, in our preschools, in our kindergartens, and all the way up through. That creates a very different mainstream classroom and the need for a curriculum that both brings them all along, but also keeps solving unstructured problems and working with new information at the fore, which demands a different kind of classroom. We're going to also think about the fact that for a long time we had it in mind that the instructional core was preparing the majority of students to engage in advanced literacy tasks, and that those who struggled really needed supplementary intervention. The reality is that in many cases we need to update that core to match today's readers and their needs and today's demands, but also we need to be totally clear that a lot of our readers' needs are never going to be met through small group intervention around something fairly constrained and tactical, right? You cannot really build up knowledge and language in the context of a small group of students who struggle. What you need is a very different learning environment over time through the days and the months and the years that is building up language and knowledge in really authentic, intensive ways. That the intervention blocks may be absolutely what readers who struggle with the code need, right? We've all worked with those readers. They need something very explicit and systematic outside of what's being offered, in addition to what's being offered as part of the literacy block. The problem when you get to that profile that I showed you in that graph, where you have a real gap between the code and the meaning within reader, that meaning-based, the underdeveloped meaning-based skills and competencies can only be bolstered over time, day after day, in a really language, knowledge-rich learning environment. We can't do it with the traditional pull-out kind of model of intervention. So we're going to think a lot about that instructional core as really the bread and butter. And what we've noticed over the last 15 years is there's this tendency to want to kind of bring in interventions and find more time for intervention, which can be excellent for those who need something short-term, intensive, and mastery-oriented. But we don't master meaning-based skills, and we can't break them down into something tactical. We need a language and knowledge-building environment from the beginning. So we're going to think about that in terms of that new approach to instruction and that instructional experience over time that builds, cultivates knowledge and academic language from the earliest years right through.
Okay. So when we think about the advanced literacy briefs, you did take a deep dive into the 2 anchor briefs that set the stage for the next generation learning standards. What's next are the 4 hallmark briefs. These are the instructional practices for advanced literacies. Hallmark 1, engaging text. Hallmark 2, rich discussion in the classroom. Hallmark 3, frequent writing. Hallmark 4, academic vocabulary and language. And then again, you get to the spotlight briefs, which are more of the how-to, talking about language production projects and units of study. Again, all of these briefs and hallmarks are available on the state ed site. As you go into phase 1 of our implementation of the next generation learning standards, I highly suggest using these hallmarks and these briefs to kind of reflect on your own literacy practices in your district, to really decide and look at as you kind of bring up your understanding in phase 1 and go into that capacity building. Where do we need to improve? Where do we need to adjust to make sure that we're doing all the things that are outlined in the next gen standards by being highlighted by these briefs? So the last thing I want to share for you today is Dr. Lesaux just really going through the briefs and giving an overview of each one for the hallmarks and for the spotlights, so that you have an understanding as you leave here today what these briefs entail.
Let me spend a couple minutes on the 4 hallmarks. We've got 4 briefs that follow on the 2 anchor briefs that lay out 4 hallmarks of advanced literacies. I'm going to spend a few minutes on those, then I'm going to tell you about the 2 spotlight briefs that you might access, and then I'm going to answer some questions. So if we ask the question, how do we foster those advanced literacy skills in today's classrooms, in the classrooms where the great majority of children are, in the classrooms that are educating our population of learners who need advanced literacy skills, what are we at least thinking about as an organizing structure? The first hallmark you'll see is that we want to work with engaging texts that feature big ideas and rich content. If we don't start with the big ideas and rich content, we won't get there. And if we think about delivering that in ways that are not really deep and connected with sets of text that I would argue have to be parts of units of study, then we're not going to get there. The second hallmark is about talk and discussion for talk and discussion's sake. Not to front load vocabulary at the beginning of a read aloud or to teach the words of the week, but to genuinely use talk and discussion as a strategy for building language and knowledge. That the actual goal of those lessons over time is about developing oral and written language for language's sake, as opposed to in the service of reading comprehension, of getting through text. The third hallmark is about writing to build language and knowledge, and I'll say more about that in a minute. And the fourth is that when we think about vocabulary instruction, we can only do so in the context of the unit of study, the text set, and a very small set of academic vocabulary words. Why? Because what we're doing with that kind of vocabulary instruction is we're studying concepts and ideas. We're not memorizing words and learning how to spell them. That's on the code side. That's important on the code side. On the meaning side, what we're doing is we're studying abstract ideas and concepts that are tied up in these academic vocabulary words. And we think about very small sets, 8 or 10 over the course of 2 or 3 weeks. Why? Because if we learn those concepts, we learn a number of words for each one, right? Abstract concepts, one has to unpack them with other abstract concepts and words. It's a different kind of approach, but it's important as long as it sits within an overall meaning-based plan. So on the text side, what we want to be clear, and I'm really sorry that you can't see these slides very well, but I will get them out to you, is we want to get away from the strugglers having really low-level text or extremely challenging text, and think instead about text sets at multiple levels in order to kind of build up the language and the knowledge. And by this, I don't necessarily mean that students aren't in grade level text the majority of the time. But we have to make sure that the texts are varied in terms of their genre, they hang together around a topic, and students have multiple opportunities to learn the same content through those text sets. You'll see in the brief that goes with Hallmark 1, we really muddy up this idea of text complexity. Why? Because there's no single measure of text complexity. It depends on the reader, the text, and the task. How complex a text is depends on the scaffolds around me, what I bring to that text, right? If I bring 80% familiarity with the words and the ideas, it's going to be less complex to me than it is to somebody next to me, and it's going to depend on the task. So what we unpack is sort of all the different indicators of text complexity and sort of arriving at an estimate of text complexity, thinking about your readers and the code and meaning-based side of their profiles. On the discussion side, what we're pushing on here is really frequent use of formats that are going to really push the classroom talk, that classroom talk in and of itself becomes a goal, that we structure it. It's not to say we want more chit-chat or necessarily noisier classrooms, but we want more productively noisier classrooms, right? We want to turn it over to students for their learning. If my talk always has to go through the teacher, I'm never going to produce the amount of academic language that I need to practice over the years of my schooling to get me to where I need to be. So now we're into the language production projects, we're into the debates, We're into sharing out. We're into explaining, practicing how do we explain our conceptual reasoning to others in a totally oral format. We're doing all of that. We're prompting students with protocols and strategies and approaches to turn the talk over to them in the context of knowledge building and language building goals. I'm going to ask you how many minutes you think the average writing assignment is in this country from a national study. How many minutes do you think the average writing assignment is for an elementary school student? How many minutes? Anybody want to guess?
15?
Yep. It is about 12 to 14 minutes, and that is it. It is isolated, it stands on its own, it is not necessarily connected to anything else. We can't really call that written language development. We could call it a warm-up, we could call it a quick getting focused, getting motivated, getting in the space of what it is we're about to do. We could call it some kind of task that connects to something we're going to do today. But we can't call it written language instruction. Written language instruction is instruction that is worked on over time, whereby the written piece is actually only about 50% of the time that we spend, that the prior 50% of time on that written piece is planning and researching and talking and thinking through what it is that I'm going to write. As a writer myself, and many of you who do your writing, you're thinking about it constantly over several days. You get stuck, you're talking it through with someone else. You're using the words that you are reading about or studying. You're bringing those in to that written piece. You're writing about something that you're now very familiar with, and then you're bringing it to a meeting to talk it through with others, or you're writing the memo to the state in response to something that you have looked at very closely. If you take all of those features and attributes, think through what that means for the curriculum. It means that the written products are tightly connected to what it is that we've been working on over time, and that they themselves are something that starts out not with a pen and a piece of paper or a pencil, but they start out with a problem or a prompt or something that I first want to think about and talk about and do some research on and maybe work in a small group and then decide on the direction I'm going to go, and then maybe I'm going to share it with a partner. We do this in first grade classrooms even, and then I'm going to get some feedback and keep going. But that is writing instruction. So as you think about how are we going to get students to the communication skills that we're looking for, the written and the oral, and how do we think about hitting real standards that have high expectations for all? Oral and written language is going to need a new kind of approach. It's going to have to be fundamental to the design, and it's going to have to develop for its sake, not in the service of something else. It's also not so much about the correcting and the perfection, of course, as it is about the process piece and the thinking piece. What they need feedback on is how they're thinking about and crafting the argument, or taking the reader's perspective, or conveying their message for others, right? That's where they're going to need support and help. So that's the third hallmark that we unpack in this work. And finally, there's the vocabulary instruction, which I won't say much more about, but it can't be in isolation, and it can't start with the words. It has to start with the content that we're studying, and we pull out of that content the academic concepts that we're going to need for this unit of study, for example. You're going to see, excuse me, that at the end of the brief series, we have a spotlight on what we call language production projects, which really kind of push on exactly what I was just talking about, developing language for language and knowledge sake over time, to apply those skills and competencies to consolidate content knowledge and to foster that academic motivation. They're very distinct in many respects from what we often see, in part because students work on them over time, and the language is the key feature. And I'm sorry again that you can't see these slides better. And the only other thing I'm going to close with is that in the end, we're very unlikely to do this work well if we don't have units of study. From our pre-K play-based classrooms where kids can be fantastic scientists and social scientists and move from the carpet to the center to the outdoor space, all the way up through to the secondary level where we want them to become expert. And I would argue that as we try to foster more academic motivation, I think we ought to think about developmentally appropriate play right through the secondary years, which is to say, there's nothing better to engage adolescents, if I put my developmental psychology hat on, nothing better than some healthy agency and competition in the context of an engaging, trusted, safe learning space, right? So if we think about some of the language production projects that we've worked on over the years, of course, totally really good fit with the profile of sort of thinking about youth development. If in fact what I'm doing is going off and doing a bunch of research and coming back and playing a certain role of expert or talking my peers through something, in the end we're going for the depth of learning, for the learning as a process, and for interactive learning. What it's going to mean over time is that we're going to have to disrupt the pattern whereby our classrooms become quieter and quieter and quieter as children age, right? As students age, we expect less and less talk. We want more and more independent work. The problem is the very principles of a really strong pre-K classroom are the same principles of a really, really strong secondary classroom. We are moving around. We know what we're working on. We're becoming expert at things. We are in charge of our learning. Our learning happens across modalities, and we talk to each other a whole lot. There's a reason the Socratic seminar is finding its way into all kinds of settings. Because if we don't turn the learning over to them, and by that I don't mean they decide, I mean we have a structure and we facilitate. We have them working on things. It's guided, it's scaffolded, but it starts with units of study. It starts with supporting teachers with really good materials and text. Teachers cannot design and deliver curriculum 180 days a year. There isn't the time, the energy, often the training, right? We want teachers to become focused and able to focus on facilitating this kind of learning environment, building up those strong relationships where everyone's focused on depth and process and interaction. So those are our two final briefs, the language production projects and the units of study, in part because if we step back to the design phase, we're going to have to think through those pieces, and the language production especially, if we're going to get this right.
I love it, if we're going to get this right. And I don't know about you all, but hopefully by the end of this evening, you're just as much in love with Dr. Nonie Lesaux as I am. She's amazing. So when you think about the hallmarks and the briefs, they are, as I said, on the state website. One last thing I want to share with you is the roadmap. So not only do we have time to implement this correctly, we have the laundry list of all those documents that you can use to support teachers, to support your district, to support your school with implementing the next generation learning standards. There is also a roadmap that the state came out with that has basically definitions of each one of the phases, goals for each phase to accomplish. Every piece of documentation that I shared, that I said is on the website, is embedded, linked within this roadmap for you. So use this as a guide as you go through your 3 phases of implementation of the next generation learning standards. It has a section for action steps that your district can take. It clearly outlines the goals for each one of the phases. And again, I know you can't see too clearly, but each one of the hot links there are areas that you can implement with activities to meet the goals. There are goals for phase 1, goals for phase 2, and then finally goals for phase 3 with full implementation. So they did give us guidance this time around. They did give us time this time around, and it just, hopefully you realize after we have gone through the keynote, the briefs, and all the information they've provided, it feels much different than it did when we implemented the Common Core Learning Standards. So thank you very much. I don't know if we want to go to next with the survey.